Hello, and welcome to Geopolitical Musings, the podcast where we simplify geopolitics so that everybody can make sense of the complicated events that govern our lives without us even realizing it. My name is Amandeep, and joining me today for the very first time is Nicolas Michelon, partner at Confluence Consultants and founder and editor of Asia Power Watch. Thank you for being here today, Nicolas. How are you?
Thanks, Amandeep. I'm very well.
I understand you've just been back from Monaco, and how was that?
Correct. Yeah, I just came back from Monaco teaching a course in MBA on responsible management, business and society responsible management. So basically talking about ESG, environmentally responsible policies, socially responsible policies in corporate governance. But always, since we have as a common point the work that we do at Confluence with the geopolitical risk and influence, always with a little bit of a different twist. And I've been basically insisting on the fact that ESG, much like many other norms and standards that we may discuss later, are being used for economic influence and to wage economic warfare on adversaries. So with that very original twist.
Also sounds like an excellent place to be this time of year. I'm sure it's getting a little bit colder where you are. You are in France now.
I am in Paris. I'm back to Parisian winter weather, about 6 or 7 degrees with rain. Yeah, Monaco was fantastic. Still this Mediterranean weather. The summer never wants to end in Monaco, so it's always nice and pleasant.
That's great. So I'm really looking forward to exploring the topics for today with you. But before we get properly started, for those of you joining us for the first time today, just a quick background of what we do. On this podcast, we aim to make geopolitics more fun, more accessible. I don't think geopolitics can be quite fun in a very casual way, but definitely make it more accessible. And we do this by using the media of books, films, and travel to explore all of the geopolitics that is around us. So on today's episode, we're going to be breaking down the book Unrestricted Warfare, the film The Siege of Jadotville, which I must admit I only watched because Jamie Dornan was on the poster. And fantastic. And Nicolas's travels in Turkey, where I hear you witnessed the merger of multiple cultures and multiple norms firsthand in 2 conferences. So let's start with the book Unrestricted Warfare. So when I first came across the title of this book, it was advertised as a manual for sort of disadvantaged nations if they ever wanted to take on a great power like the United States. For me personally, it didn't quite read like that. It read more like a wake-up call for the world to understand the unrestricted aspect of warfare, of modern warfare, that war is all around us, that security breaches can in fact happen from anywhere, and they're not very difficult to execute. So let's hear from you, Nicolas, your take on why this book is a potential essential read for geopolitics.
Well, I think, first of all, I got to say that you summarized it perfectly, because there are really those 2 elements in that book. First of all, and it was written as such, and we have to remind listeners that it was written by 2 Chinese military officers from the People's Liberation Army Air Force. One of them still teaches in a military academy in mainland China. And it was really written with this Chinese philosophy that came mostly from Mao Zedong himself during the civil war between the Communist Party and the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek. Mao Zedong really developed an entire theory on how to wage war from the weak to the strong. How can you take Goliath down when you are David? When you do not have the weaponry that the adversary has, when you do not have the funds that the adversary has, when you do not have the hard power that the adversary enjoys. Yet, through cognitive encirclement, information warfare, and many of the other elements that are covered in this book and that we'll be discussing later, you are able to damage the foundations of the adversary's very strength, and you're basically able to rebalance the balance of power in your favor. So it's really one of the first aspects of this book. It was very much the starting point, and I will go back to the genesis of the book, how it was written, why it was written, when it was written, and as a result of what kind of experience on the part of China it was written. The second aspect that you've very rightly mentioned is that it is the description of what pretty much every power out there is practicing today. Both hegemonic powers, obviously, the US and China, are practicing unrestricted warfare. And what's interesting is that even though the book was written by two Chinese authors in 1999, we can actually notice that many of the strategies that they're advocating have been practiced by the US, have been implemented by France, by Germany earlier. Not always with this kind of discourse, underpinning it, but more or less anyway, strategies that we've seen in the past. And by the way, the book uses a lot of historical references, as you've noticed, from Napoleonic Wars, from different sorts of wars within China during the many centuries that China took to take its current shape, but also to the wars waged by America, to the wars waged by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, for example. So they draw from many different experiences. So it's not an entirely a purely Chinese take. I would say it's a Chinese digestion of what has been observed in many other places, in many other parts of the world. So that second element is indeed, we have a description now of what pretty much every hegemonic power and middle power are practicing today, which is waging warfare outside of the classic boundaries of the military. Maybe we could start by discussing how this book came about, because it's very important to understand the impact of the book. We have to understand the reason that is behind those two military officers to write this book. The book, as I said, was written in 1999 originally. I think there has been a revised version in 2004 in China. I do not think that the revised version has been translated yet. The translations that we have here, I'm using the French version, sorry, so it's called La Guerre hors limite. Unrestricted Warfare in English has been translated in virtually all major languages out there. So it was initially written in 1999. The starting point is very simple. Those two gentlemen, Xiao Liang and Wang Xiangsui, so they are colonels in the People's Liberation Army Air Force. They've been witnessing the first Gulf War in 1991. Okay, so this is the starting point. They're basically asking themselves a very simple question. Could we take on the US back then in 1991? They're noticing the massive gap that back then that you could witness between US military power and Chinese military power. They're basically recognizing a simple fact. We, China, back in 1991, could not project 250,000 men halfway across the globe, together with the group of another 80-something countries, to wage high-intensity war for about 6 months on any country for that matter. It happened to be Iraq, but on any country. We, China, back then, we're not able to do that, which means we could not take on the US on that particular ground, nor should we try to. It would be exhausting our resources trying to catch up. The US will always be one step ahead if we're just trying to catch up. So they are advocating another type of strategy. And here they're drawing, without necessarily recognizing it officially, but when you know a little bit about contemporary Chinese strategic philosophy, you know that it pretty much all starts with Mao Zedong and especially the Little Red Book of Mao Zedong. They basically draw on this idea of fighting from the weak to the strong. And they're proposing that there is a way you can take down a stronger opponent. It's through a multi-dimensional conflict. Multi-dimensional conflict, which means you will take the fight to the adversary on all the other domains where you have a competitive advantage outside of the purely military domain. So they're advocating, for example, and we will go through in detail one by one because we have many examples and not only coming from China, by the way. They're advocating the use of lawfare, legal warfare. You don't have the guns, you don't have the drones, you don't have the submarines, you don't have the aircraft carriers, but you have your law. And your law can be used as a very powerful weapon to weaken the adversary, to weaken their companies, to weaken their industries. China have been become a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001, it has become the factory of the world. Hence the narrative started by the Trump administration: the world needs to decouple away from China. It's too risky. We've built too much of a dependency, of an economic and technological dependency on China. But China enjoying this position, they don't need the aircraft carriers as much. All they need is a very strong and aggressive piece of legislation that could punish, let's say, American companies if the American government tries to make military moves that are contrary to Chinese strategic interest. So the use of lawfare. The United States has been doing it for quite some time. Actually, they've started even before this book was written. The United States is using, for example, and abusing one of their most powerful piece of legislation, which is the FCPA, the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, which initially was a piece of legislation aiming at preventing American companies from practicing corruption. But then they decided, why stop to American companies? How about we start applying our legislation to any company on this planet that practices corruption? And how can they apply that American legislation on any company of the planet that practices corruption? Through the use of the US dollar. If corruption is practiced in US dollar being considered as US territory, then the US Department of Justice can sue you anywhere you are. We have examples. I'm French. I have many examples of French companies. For example, the French company Alstom was hit by a massive fine by the US Department of Justice over a case of corruption that they may have practiced in Indonesia. Since when US law applies in Indonesia on a French company? Well, since the US dollar.
Yeah.
We have other elements within lawfare, the use of sanctions. You can hurt your adversary through the use of sanctions, embargoes, forbidding your own companies from doing business with the adversary, which is exactly what is happening now. I mean, this is pretty much the crux of the issue in the tech war that the Biden administration picked up from the Trump administration. It's all about sanctions now, export controls. I do not want you to contribute to the success of the adversary, and I want you to contribute to suffocating the adversary, financially speaking, or in terms of its access to technology, for example.
Yeah. There's actually there's quite a lot in the book as well, which is interesting because, like you mentioned, it's written in 1999, which was a long time ago. But they've done quite a few predictions about where sanctions could go and where this modern warfare could go, and they've been very accurate about how the US will continue to use its economic leverage and economic power over the developing Asian states. So the rising nations at the time, they were essentially forced to enter into free trade agreements with the US. Otherwise, business with them will struggle. So you're quite right. I mean,
Absolutely.
the sanctions have been kind of ongoing and like a BAU threat almost.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a very, if you allow me this expression, tough love on the part of the US. It is something that China is basically reminding everyone in the so-called global South that, you know, if you are in business with the US, beware. You know, we have this expression in Europe, and as far as I know, the Chinese are reusing it and proposing it everywhere in Central Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. Being an enemy of the US is dangerous. Being an ally of the US is fatal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they are reminding this. The two authors are proposing some other tools, of course, apart from lawfare and the use of extraterritorial law to weaken the adversary. And one of the main toolbox at any country's disposal is economic warfare, purely economic warfare. So in this case, weaponizing trade, weaponizing finance, your financial markets, weaponizing technological norms and standards, weaponizing natural resources. I mean, we all know, and at Confluence, we've written at length about the issue of how fragile supply chains can be on critical raw materials when those supply chains are controlled by one hegemonic power only. You can use development aid as a weapon of influence and in terms of economic warfare. If development aid it's a very powerful tool, starting with the image of it. There you have people in distress carrying a bag of rice or flour with a massive flag on it, given by the people of the People's Republic of China or given by the people of Japan. So it is a fantastic tool for information warfare through development aid. And this is precisely what China has been doing through its Belt and Road Initiative project. It is branding it as one massive program of development aid through the financing of infrastructures that are direly needed by those countries for their economic development. So there you are, there you have the possibility to dig into this toolbox of all sorts of economic and financial tools that you can use to, again, weaken the adversary. Look at finance and financial markets. We see something very interesting happening as we speak. The New York Stock Exchange is forcing many Chinese companies to delist. We don't want you anymore. So you delist, list elsewhere. The idea being Chinese companies are considered as adversary companies. I will remind the listeners that countries, for example, in Europe, brand China a partner, a competitor, and an adversary. So which one is it? A partner or an adversary? But that includes adversary. So the New York Stock Exchange basically tells those Chinese companies, the likes of the Huawei's and the TikToks, etc., you do not get to list here anymore, because we do not want the company that hails from an adversary country to have access, preferential access, to international funds. But what's interesting is that China is applying the exact same pressure on their companies. Beijing tells those same companies, we do not want you to list on the New York Stock Exchange or on the London Stock Exchange, because we do not want you to contribute to the preeminence of the Western financial markets. Yeah. So there you have those Chinese companies being weaponized in the same way with the exact same strategies by two opposing governments who are trying to use finance as a weapon to weaken the adversary. And we have the same with norms and standards. Norms and standards is an extremely powerful tool because it's one of those fights that if you win it, you've pretty much won the war altogether. We talked about my teaching in Monaco. That course that I was teaching in Monaco yesterday and the day before was about business and society responsible management. So obviously we were talking about ESG, environmental standards, socially responsible investment, corporate governance, etc. But we have to consider that beyond the moral issues associated with ESG, beyond the ethical frameworks associated with ESG, which, by the way, are very relative. Which ethical framework should apply where? Ethical frameworks depends on religious background of a market, on the cultural background, on the philosophical ideas that are widely shared in that market. What is considered socially responsible in India may not be the same as what is considered socially responsible in Norway. The levels of urgency are different when it comes to environmentally friendly policies. The level of urgency in Canada may not be the same as in the UAE, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one of those, it's all relative kind of topic. But what's interesting is that, and this is what interests us at Confluence, is that when you add the element of geopolitical risk and economic warfare and influence, you realize that ESG is this one set of norms and standards that is becoming the preferred weapon to fight this war of influence between two different models of the two hegemonic powers. And what's interesting is that you have middle powers like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, for example, who are trying to propose an alternative to this fight between the two giants. And they're trying to propose their own set of ESG standards, which could possibly serve as a role model for many other global South economies. But I think our listeners should not be mistaken. ESG is a set of norms and standards, just like any other, just like norms and standards on lithium, on cobalt, on rare earth elements, for example, that is being used for economic warfare. Why? Because if you manage to impose your norm and standard, your definition of what is environmentally friendly, what is socially responsible, what is good corporate governance, well, you've pretty much won the war. Because your companies, they've already been adapting to those standards, so they are always way forward from the competition. The competition will have to play catch up. Oh, this is the new norm that this country is managing to impose. So I have to transform my production processes. My entire industrial process has to be transformed. And by the time you do that, and it costs you to do that, well, the competition is moving forward. They're already, winning massive contracts by the time you try to play catch up with this. So the war through norms and standards, it's absolutely critical. And of course, it's always shrouded in that veil of good ethics, good morals, of course. You don't want to be talking about standards for the sake of warfare. So you talk about standards to save the polar bears, the standards to save the primal forest, standards because corruption is bad.
The norms and standards, I think, is a very powerful one. Like you said, if you are able to impose your norms and standards, you've basically won the war. And it's something that's also mentioned in the book about how since the end of the Cold War, and they've done quite a bit of a review of the Gulf War as well. So this was immediately after the end of the Cold War. And what they've said is that the US seems to be in a position where they just want to be able to find a war or find a situation in which they can be in that position to impose their norms and standards. So the first success was after the Cold War, when they won, because the communist norms and communist ideas basically crashed. And for the US, it was a success story. And now they found the Gulf War, they found the Iraq-Kuwait situation as another area where they could impose their norms and standards. And again, they won that, albeit not in ways that they agreed with in the military side of things. But it's interesting because, and again, they said that they're just kind of looking for these situations of conflict that they can mold based on their convenience to be able to impose their ideas again. So do you agree with that? Do you think that we are, or that the US is in a situation even now where they are almost always on the lookout for any avenue of conflict or any other kind of, it doesn't have to be an armed conflict, of course, where they can exert their influence?
I think I totally agree with this statement, and I think it comes from the very culture of the U.S. And I would basically make a distinction between the religious aspect and the historical aspect of how the U.S. was created and the founding myth. First of all, you obviously have the religious aspect, as most people know. All forms of Christian faith, be it Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, and the many churches within Protestantism, there is always this central element of universality, of the story that is being told to us of this relationship between God and his creation. Christians do not believe in a Christian God. They live in a God for everybody. Some are aware of it, they are Christians. Some are not aware of it, they're not Christian. But there is a sense of universality, which explains a lot of it. It is not, I would not want to oversimplify history, but it is an element of explanation for the colonial adventures, this drive by European nations to go and explore always further away, because as soon as you have a suspicion that someone might be living on the other side of that endless piece of body of water, well, you have to take the good word to them. So it has been a drive, for better and for worse, obviously. So in the case of the United States, as our listeners know, I guess, the religious element and some of the very radical religious ideas, especially stemming from those new Protestant churches. And that's the issue with Protestantism. Any church can be created by anyone. I mean, you can decide that you create your own separate church because the one that you were hailing from does not satisfy you anymore, which is not the case in Catholicism. Catholicism and Orthodoxy are extremely hierarchical. So you're supposed to answer to one person, the Pope, or the head of the Orthodox Church. But in Protestantism, it's much more like closer to Islam in this sense, little to no hierarchy, which means anybody can basically interpret their own way. And this has led in the US to some very radical interpretation in terms of what is universal value. And that includes the possibility of imposing your values because they were made to be universal. And then you have to add on top of this the very history of the US and some of the founding myth. And the most important, the most potent founding myth of the US is that idea that they've built a city on a hill. What is a city on a hill? Is the city closest to the heavenly Jerusalem. They've decided that they are the closest, which means our values are better. Our norms and standards are better.
Yeah.
The way we consider what is socially responsible, that should be the standard. The way what we consider is good corporate governance, that has to be the standard. Everybody has to veer towards that one point, that one direction that we are pointing out. There's always this joke, you know, the idiot, when you point out the moon, the idiot looks at the finger. So the US is trying to convince those countries that they deem idiots just looking at the finger, say, no, look at the moon. I'm trying pointing out the moon now. I'm just stop looking at the finger, you know. But I think this is basically the situation where we are in right now. The problem is, for about 40 years, from the collapse of the Soviet Union up until the Trump administration, I would put the Trump administration as really one of the starting points for this new phase in globalization. For all that time, the US was enjoying total hegemony, monopolistic hegemony. Even during the Cold War, I would like to argue that the Soviet Union never reached a point of influence that China has reached on its own today. The problem to reach that point is that you need to have some sort of exemplarity. And when you fail to have that exemplarity, you fail to give, you know, this envy, this drive for other country to emulate what you do. The US has been able to do this. China is able today to counter that narrative and tell them, no, there is an alternative model. And a lot of countries, especially in the global south, are tempted to try that alternative model.
Yeah. So this concept of the model that the US proposes and the counter narrative that China is proposing. There was one mention in the book as well about something that the chief of staff in one of the US defense divisions said, that the US always seems to be preparing for a cold type war that may never happen again. And this is something they said after the Cold War. And I feel like I disagree with that, because I feel like we are living in a state of a cold type war, even though, you know, nothing can match the scale of the US and USSR divisions. And it's the kind of polarization of the ideas, that extent doesn't exist today. But do you think that that is the kind of cold type war that we are living in right now? We've got the China bloc and the US bloc, maybe not as divided as they were back then, but do you think that is the kind of situation we are in?
I think there's a major difference from the Cold War as we knew it between the US bloc and the USSR bloc, is that this time around, there's no firm bloc anymore. Mm-hmm. We cannot really say, at least it's not my opinion, that the US is leading a common bloc. I mean, you can see many differences, many strategic divergences within that so-called Western bloc. I'm always very uncomfortable when people talk about the West. I mean, I'm like, please define the West. Strategic interests of Europe are totally different, totally divergent from the US. Of course, European elites are keeping Europe in a state of vassality to the US, but it does not mean that strategic interests are the same. We could easily argue that China has no friend. China doesn't have friends. China has business partners. They do not have friends. And it's very clear with the situation between Israel and Palestine and this renewed conflict in the Middle East, we thought for a while that, oh, China has made a new friend, Saudi Arabia. Well, not quite, apparently. Not quite. A business deal is not enough to cement an alliance. I would argue the same between China and Russia. The sanctions that Europe and the US and Japan have imposed on Russia has pushed Russia even more into the arms of China. But we cannot define that relationship as a relationship of an alliance. There is still a high level of mistrust and distrust between the two economies, between the two countries. On many topics, on many issues, there are radically divergent views on how to approach the problem, divergent strategic interests. So I think this context of conflict that we are entering into is very different from the Cold War, which means it will last much longer. Right. We are in this for a couple of centuries.
A couple of centuries is very interesting. This also, it brings to mind another sentence from the book that alliances are no longer based on ideologies, but on interests. So if we think about the Soviet Union and its allies, they were primarily communist, but today China and Russia may be ideologically quite similar, but BRICS nations, for example, completely different. That alliance has absolutely no commonality except for them all being part of the global south and part of wanting to be the change.
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons of, if I may just finish on this, one of the drive for an alliance now is very simply, are we the victim of the same weapon of economic war? If the answer is yes, how about we get together on that particular topic and try to find a solution? BRICS as a project to accelerate the de-dollarization of the economy, to put all those economies away from the long arm of the US Department of Justice. But as you said, I mean, in the other side of the coin is that those alliances can be very fragile. They can be very fluid.
Yeah. Let's move on to our second segment where we talk about film that clarifies some of the geopolitical issues that we are surrounded by. So as I said, the film for today is The Siege of Jadotville. It is something that I wasn't actually quite familiar with. It was from the 60s, one of the consequent proxy conflicts during the Soviet days, during the Cold War. And while the film on its own doesn't quite shed much light on the geopolitical affairs of the time or the Cold War politics, it does do an excellent job of the armed effort that went into it. The purpose of the film was to talk about the Irish effort as part of the UN's peacekeeping mission in the area. So Jadotville is part of the Katanga province of the Congo area. It is rich in minerals, and that was why it was the center of conflict in those days. And Nicolas, actually, have you watched this film?
I have not watched the film yet. I did read the book. I remember reading the book when it came out, on which the film is based.
Yeah, so for the listeners, for context, it starts with the execution of the then Prime Minister, who was actually the first elected Prime Minister since independence from Belgium, Prime Minister Lumumba. And one of his policies was going to be the nationalization of the mining industry, which would have obviously not been quite helpful for the business owners or for the Western states. Sorry for the generalization, but in this context, together, we're gonna pool the Western states together. It wouldn't have been quite helpful for them because they were depending on the minerals in Congo for the guidance systems that they were producing, which was obviously quite important back then because of the conflict. So the reason that this film I would recommend is because, well, first of all, it's less than 2 hours, so you can get through it very quickly, get through understanding the kind of basics of that conflict quite quickly. And the other reason is because it feels like it's a direct parallel with the situation that we're observing in Africa today. There is a minerals race ongoing. Everybody wants to be able to establish influence there. So everybody from powers like the US, France, right down to China, and also middle powers like UAE and Saudi Arabia, who are now investing in Africa to be able to influence this race for minerals. The other part that really stands out is how there's a parallel in political instability. So the general from the army was able to take over after assassinating the prime minister very easily. And that is something that we observe today as well. The ease with which we can cause political instability in Africa is mind-boggling, to say the least. There's been, I think, more than 8 coups in the last decade or so.
2 years, in the last 2 years, I would say.
Yeah. So I mean, it is quite. It just boggles the mind, because that level of instability, it shouldn't exist anywhere, but it does, because it's such a mineral-rich place that it can be the center of conflict. So yeah, that is the reason that I would 100% recommend this film. But again, like I said, it doesn't quite shed light on the political affairs.
No, I think you're totally spot on your description of the movie, and from what I remember from the book. What struck me really is that not so much has changed. Today's condition of warfare have, of course, evolved technologically speaking. Yes, we are fighting wars with drones now. I mean, we've seen this between Azerbaijan and Armenia. We've seen this at length between Russia and Ukraine. Wars are being fought with hypersonic missiles. We're talking about underwater nuclear torpedoes, etc. Toys that were not at the disposal of any military back at the time of the siege of Jadotville. But the fundamental philosophy behind the conflict, the fundamental reasons, that has not changed. We are still very much, and this is really what struck me in that book, and from what you described of the movie, they really kept that spirit. What really struck me is that we still very much live in a 19th century, first half of 20th century type of world. A world that was described by the likes of Bismarck in Germany as might is right. Might is right. If I can do it, if I have the power, then the entire ethical framework imposes itself. The entire philosophy of the action becomes evident, becomes obvious, and is acceptable if I have that might. Might is right. The law will follow the power. We are fighting for the same things as in the past. It's being done by different actors. So yes, we have new players in that game now in the 21st century. We have China playing that game. As you rightly said, we have the UAE playing that game, Saudi Arabia, Turkey is playing that game, Morocco is playing that game. So you have new players, but the game has not changed. The weapons have changed, but the game has not changed. Now we have the use of private military companies to do that work. And in the movie, you see the action of mercenary groups. I think, if I remember correctly, one of the mercenary group is led by a Frenchman, a French mercenary. We still had a few of them active in Africa back then. I think not so many anymore. But now it's private military companies from China, from Russia, for example. I hear from human intelligence in Africa that some Russian private military companies are protecting Chinese-owned mines, for example. So the same kind of scenario is unfolding. The tools are different. The technology has changed. And I think this is the confusion that a lot of people make. They think that new technology means new philosophy. I think those conflicts show us that this is not true. The philosophy stays the same. If anything, we're actually reverting into a world that is brutally 19th century-like, when powers recreate areas of influence which could be almost described as new colonism. We have the same kind of mindset. We have the same kind of resources that are at stake. We're talking about artificial intelligence, but we're still fighting over cobalt. We're still fighting over lithium. And this is, I think, the beauty of watching those films now that show us a reality from an older time, from before the end of the Cold War, and we actually see that we have not made that much progress apart from the technology aspect. But the technology aspect doesn't have much impact on the nature of policy. And I think this is what people need to remember.
You know, you said that the philosophies don't change and that the game actually overall hasn't changed. I think that could also be said of, obviously, so many things in the contemporary order have changed. There's, the kind of unilateral order has been replaced with a sort of diluted unilateral order. I wouldn't say it's multilateral because the influence of the US it just can't be compared. So there is a dilution of that unilateral order, but I would still say that the situations that arise now, the conflicts that arise now, they are quite reflective of the way things were at the end of the Cold War. So, like you said, the game overall hasn't actually quite changed. So when you compare development levels or growth levels or power levels, it seems like it's still in the same kind of comparison. So the US is still the hegemon, and Russia, China, India, they can all still be grouped together. And a lot of people have also said that as we move towards, let's say, 2050 or a few decades hence, that balance is still going to stay the same. The US is still going to be the most powerful, that India will still be a rising giant, but internal problems will probably not let it get to a state where they can be compared to the strength of China or to any other fully developed Western state. So yeah, I agree that the game actually probably hasn't quite changed.
Absolutely. I think the one element that we may need to keep in mind is that some of the resources that we are fighting over could easily be exhausted in our lifetime. And that could be a game changer from the previous scenarios we had up until the Cold War, when those resources were sometimes fought over, but with no horizon of full exhaustion within our lifetime. This time around, this could be a game changer. And this could be one of the elements that makes those current conflicts and the future conflict that will happen going forward become a bit different. There will not be enough for everybody.
Yeah, that intensifies the race even more then, doesn't it? So it probably reinforces that order of one strength compared to the other.
Absolutely.
You also mentioned that Turkey has an influential role to play in Africa, and we've spoken quite a lot about Turkey in the previous episodes. It's not that we have a bias towards Turkey, it's just that it's such an enigmatic rising power. So Nicolas, tell us about your travels in Turkey and the conferences that you attended.
Well, it was actually a discovery for me because it's a country where I first set foot in literally in September, last September. So I'm normally an East Asia expert, and this is another part of geographic Asia that I'm discovering rather late in my life. The occasion to go there for the first time in September was to attend a conference organized by a para-public organization called DTIK, which has links to the Turkish government, but that is not a fully public authority either. It's kind of sitting in between the public and the private space. And what they organized there for this conference was basically a discussion amongst Turkish companies. And what's important is that the participants were virtually exclusively companies from the private sector, a discussion on how Turkey can increase its soft power through its diaspora. So the idea would be, how can Turkey capitalize? I would not say weaponize, I would say capitalize, because they are at the stage where they're really focusing on capitalizing on it for the moment. Capitalize on Turcophony. So all those people that speak either Turkish or a Turkic-related language. So you obviously had representatives from Azerbaijan, you had representatives from Kazakhstan, from Uzbekistan, but also, interestingly, representatives of Turkish-speaking communities in the Caucasus, in Georgia. Also, in the Balkans, we had representatives of Muslim Turkish-speaking communities in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, in Moldova, for example. And the idea was really for them to assess the potential of economic and trade partnerships that they could build on the basis of a common language and a common cultural heritage and cultural background. So, of course, Westerners would look at this as an attempt to recreate the Ottoman Empire, which, when you discuss with Turkish people, whether they are pro-Erdogan or anti-Erdogan, everybody laughs at this very idea of resuscitating the Ottoman Empire. Nobody believes in that. Actually, many of the Erdogan supporters don't even believe in that themselves. That being said, and usually one of their own criticism is that the Ottoman Empire overextended itself, which brought it to its demise. So this time around, what they are very interested in building is something that is smaller in size, smaller in geography, more reduced in geography, but really anchored in a cultural proximity, in a linguistic proximity. So that was an extremely interesting experience. President Erdogan came to the conference and gave a speech, which was a very geopolitical speech. That one was in September. I'll talk about the next one that he gave in the second conference that I attended in October, which happened after October 7th, so the attack by Hamas on Israel. But the first one was given in September, so long enough before that event. But it was still already a very geopolitical speech. A lot of jabs directed at NATO, coming from a NATO member.
Yeah.
And our listeners should remember that Turkey has the second most powerful military in NATO after the US. And then you had the president of Turkey distributing jabs to the US, the EU as a whole, Great Britain as well, and really addressing those Turkish companies and those Azeri companies and Kazakh companies and telling them basically, and he actually pronounced those words, the only friend of a Turk is another Turk.
Wow.
This comes from a country that is a member of NATO and from a country that officially is still a candidate to some form of adhesion to the EU. Yeah. The only friend of a Turk is a Turk. So that was.
Quickly ask you. So these jabs at NATO members. You mentioned specifically the US, EU, and there was a third one. US,
the Great Britain
and Britain. So do you think that these jabs are somewhat related to its status as a rising power? It may have faced, like with the EU, for example, it seems like it's disenchanted with the EU because its accession process has taken so long. And again, an alliance with the US and the UK would depend primarily on their interests because of the power that they hold. So do you think that these jabs at NATO members are a way for them to get closer to the middle powers, to be able to represent their grievances as well?
Absolutely. I mean, what President Erdogan is trying to do, and it's becoming even more apparent now that the Israel-Palestine conflict is unfortunately completely overblown in full steam again, what President Erdogan is doing right now is to try and become and accelerate this process for Turkey to become the spokesperson for the entire Muslim world, number one, and this spokesperson, one of the spokespersons for the global South. And that's a very tricky strategy. It has paid off so far. I think regardless of what we think of President Erdogan's domestic policies and his own personal ideology regarding political Islam, regarding nationalism, the heritage of Atatürk, etc., regardless of what we think of that, he has managed to capitalize on the war in Ukraine, for example, to reposition Turkey as a power broker, as a peacemaker in that region, for the very fact that Turkey sits where it sits, geographically speaking. I mean, you could even argue that whoever is at the head of Turkey enjoys this fantastically, eminently geopolitical situation just because of its geography itself. I was having drinks with some Turkish friends one evening by the Bosphorus on the European side, watching the Asian side, which can reach in 20 minutes by boat. And there you see geopolitics passing in front of your eyes. Russian warships passing by, trade boats from Russia passing by. All of this under control of the Republic of Turkey, because they enjoy that total control over passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So Turkey enjoys this, and I think we can easily argue that President Erdogan has been playing that card beautifully. Now, the second conference that I attended was in October. And this one was even more interesting because, first of all, it happened right after the attack by Hamas on Israeli kibbutz in the south of Israel, literally 2 days after. And the forum that I attended was the Turkish Africa Economic and Business Forum. So there, the idea was to put together Turkish business owners, entrepreneurs, and African business owners from all over Africa, French-speaking Africa, English-speaking Africa, and Northern Africa, Arabic-speaking Northern Africa, getting them together and getting them to decide together on what should be the priorities for economic partnerships throughout the continent with Turkish companies. A very interesting something I witnessed, which really blew my mind. I am French, as you reminded our listeners, and people know that we have a few ex-colonies in Africa that have been, running military coups to get rid of French influence. There I was, as far as I know, the only French national attending this conference. Not one person from the French embassy was sent from Ankara to witness, at least try to understand, what is Turkey doing, talking to those countries that used to be our colonies, where we're supposed to have, us French, still some sort of economic influence. I mean, it was so mind-blowing that at one point, I was passing between groups of business owners, Turkish and African, speaking together in French. About
not with
how
the French.
but not with the French, on how to increase bilateral partnerships without the French people being involved in the French language.
Oh my goodness.
It was a
not
thing
even
of
trying
beauty.
to sideline you. It's like you're being sidelined without actually being sidelined. It's your language, it's kind of your culture, and you're not one of them.
But it tells you, the disconnect between some remnants of influence, the language in this case, and the fact that the country that brought that language in the first place is totally out of the game now, doesn't know how to address the needs of those ex-colonies with which it's supposed to have kept some preferential relationships, and now France has become totally unable to answer those needs. And Turkey, the Turkish companies that were present, defense, infrastructure, energy, they are meeting all the needs. And of course, Turkey is not the only one to do that. Yeah. The UAE does that, Saudi Arabia, Morocco is branding itself as the champion of Africa. In that sense. On hydrogen, on phosphate, Morocco is the undisputed leader on those topics. And they really want to propose to all African countries that Morocco takes that leadership, technological leadership in norms and standards again.
Yeah.
So it was extremely interesting. And then again, President Erdogan came to that forum. He addressed the first 5 to 10 minutes, win-win partnerships. Turkey will contribute to the development of Africa in a win-win fashion. The usual, everybody says that in every forum. But then he switched very rapidly for a full half hour on an extremely offensive geopolitical speech. The TV was present, so he was not addressing us, attendees of the forum. He was addressing his electors. There's an upcoming election in Turkey, municipal elections that are coming up very soon. So he was addressing his electors. And 2 days after the attack by Hamas on the kibbutzim in southern Israel and the start of the retaliation in the military campaign by Israel on Gaza, he gave a very offensive speech whereby he, of course, accused Israel of being overly violent in its response, but most importantly, he focused most of his speech on the US and European negative influence in that region. Right. So he served an extremely offensive, even BRICS countries don't serve that kind of speeches. There you have, again, a NATO member serving an extremely offensive speech, criticizing negative influence on the part of the US and Europe, and basically, in a nutshell, saying that what happened 2 days ago is the result of US policy in the Middle East. is the result of lack of leadership from Europe. So he basically prepared his audience to what he said even more recently: new leadership is needed. And guess what?
That's me.
We would like to be that. We would like to be that new leader.
Yeah. So do you think such foreign policy wins, or attempts for foreign policy wins, would convince the local population in Turkey to keep voting for him?
It's from what I've observed and the many discussions I've had, I'm aware that it was Istanbul, and Istanbul is not the whole of Turkey, evidently. President Erdogan was mayor of Istanbul. The current mayor of Istanbul is opposition to the AKP party of President Erdogan. So Istanbul is a city that has been going back and forth between more like European-friendly policies and more nationalist, pan-Islamic policies. They've been going back and forth. Izmir and Ankara are firmly in the hands of the opposition. But then there's the whole rest of Turkey, and especially those regions that vote massively for Erdogan. So from the discussion I've had in Istanbul, which is by nature probably contains some bias, there are two things that come out of the discussions on whether people are going to be voting for or against Erdogan. Domestic policies versus international policy. For international policy, unless you speak to extremely radical anti-Erdogan citizens, most of the people, especially in the business sector, admit that what Erdogan's administration has been doing and how they've been capitalizing and playing Turkey's cards as a result of the conflict with Ukraine, and now with this renewed conflict in the Middle East, is fairly positive for Turkey in terms of Turkish power and Turkish influence overseas. So there seems to be a general agreement, even when it comes to relationship with Europe. The most anti-Erdogan, which usually are the most pro-European, even they say Europe has turned their back on us. It's over. We have to find another way. Yeah. They do not want us because we are a majority Muslim country, at least on paper, which is unfortunately largely true. Now, the big difference is when it comes to domestic policies. And this is where the very violent fight between pro-Erdogan and anti-Erdogan is being fought. And I had not seen in a long time such violence in the discourse between anti-Erdogans and pro-Erdogans. It's extremely violent. Of course, one of the first topics that crystallizes that opposition is the heritage of Atatürk.
Yeah.
They just celebrated the 100 years of the Republic. They just commemorated the death of Atatürk literally a little over a week ago. The heritage of Atatürk is still, I would say, problematic for many Turkish people. You have an entire part of the population that has veneration, absolute veneration for the man. I come from Southern Europe, Mediterranean Europe, very Catholic. Usually we have an image of Jesus in the kitchen. They have a portrait of Atatürk in their kitchen. So it is this level of veneration for the man and his heritage and everything he did to modernize Turkey and to make sure that Turkey transformed itself from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire into a modern republic that could take on any European power and then possibly other powers later on. Where that heritage seems to be fairly appreciated even amongst many voters of Atatürk. The big problem of Erdogan, sorry. The big problem comes when we talk about the religious heritage. Atatürk did not ban the Islamic veil for women, but he banned the traditional hat for men. He made sure he would put religion in a corner of society. He didn't go as far as French revolutionaries in 1789, which destroyed churches, murdered priests. He did nothing like this, even though he was heavily influenced by French revolutionary ideas. but he made sure that the Turkish Republic would be an a-religious republic, politically speaking. And this is where the heritage creates a rift. You have a large part of the population in Turkey, especially in the countryside, in Anatolia, who vote for Erdogan, who want to put back religion in the center of everyday life, including in the center of politics. Whereas the voters of the main opposition party, the CHP, are really very attached to the fact that religion should be on the side. They all tell you that, yeah, I am Muslim. I am Muslim. They don't deny it.
Yeah.
But those CHP voters usually tell you, I never go to mosque. I may do Ramadan in a light way. They refuse the veil. They refuse, inequality between genders and all that. So they're very modern in the Western sense of the term that way. So for domestic policies, you really have that massive rift. Then you have a major gap also between anti-Erdogans and pro-Erdogans over economic policy. We're talking about a country that's still struggling with 60+% inflation. For food inflation, it's over 70% food inflation. It looks like Erdogan has heard the criticism. When he was re-elected, he changed the Minister of the Economy, he changed the governor of the central bank, and he nominated a woman who doesn't wear a veil, trained at the IMF, if I'm not wrong. So a very modern, in Western eyes, type of governor for the central bank. So we'll have to see how that pans out. But the real divide is on domestic policy. It's on education system, the way the education system, higher and lower education, are being managed now. Many universities, the deans of universities have been changed, nominated by the AKP or AKP-related administrations. I hear that the military, the Turkish military, is not done getting rid of elements that are under suspicion of having collaborated in the attempted coup in 2016, for example. So internally, there is still some major divides. There seems to be a general agreement that foreign policy, it's working out for Turkey, whether or not you agree with Erdogan himself.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be on the stage of global observance again. Everybody is watching Turkey. Everybody appreciates that it's in a very critical position. And, like you mentioned, even geographically, it's at that very interesting spot. And I remember when you mentioned for the first time that you could see battleships just cruising by. It's an exciting thought, isn't it? Where you can witness it in real time happening, the things that you only read about, but you can actually see it happening.
Absolutely. It's geopolitics right in front of you with a cocktail in hand. I mean,
yeah.
you and I, what can we dream of? What else can we dream of?
It really does sound like the dream.
And if I may just wrap up this discussion on those two conferences that I attended in Turkey, one number. In 2002, Turkey had 12 embassies throughout Africa. 12 in 2002. They had 44 at the end of 2022. In 20 years, they went from 12 embassies to 44. As we speak, and I made sure I counted, I went on Turkish Airlines website to count it myself to make sure the number was accurate. Turkish Airlines has 51 direct connections between Istanbul and African cities. 51. No other airline in the world has that. And Turkish Airlines has become one of the three pillars of Turkish economic influence in Africa. Diplomacy is one.
Yeah.
So the acceleration in opening diplomatic missions and representations in all African countries. Companies, especially construction and infrastructure, where Turkish companies are leaders in the region, and Turkish Airlines. So the importance of one company being one of the three pillars for Turkish economic influence in Africa. It's been confirmed to me by all the entrepreneurs that I could meet, and all of them told me, confirmed, I would ask them that question, and they confirmed that the fact that Turkish Airlines has a direct flight is a good point to consider setting up shop in that African country for them. They would rather go to a country that has a direct connection between Istanbul and there than go to a city that does not.
Yeah.
So Turkish Airlines is delivering on that promise. 51 direct connections.
I'm actually so impressed with the Turkish airline connection. I think it's so simple, but such an elegant solution just to physically establish yourself in a place. It's a beautiful solution. All right, in the interest of time, we're going to move very quickly to the geopolitical fun fact of the day. And I know in the past 2 episodes I've gone on about James Bond, and I was very tempted to do it again, but I've decided to move on to other parts of other interesting parts of geopolitics. We've spoken a lot about American influence, about the Cold War, and this is something that I have brought up with a lot of people in conversation, that I feel like as a global community, we have the tendency to refer back to history and to modern history quite a lot. And it almost seems like an obsession, just being obsessed with wanting to go back to the dynamics of history. And one such space of kind of just fixating on history is the assassination of JFK. And another aspect of American politics that's been on the news lately is the shutdown, or the potential shutdown, of the US government, which yet again has been avoided, almost avoided. Mike Johnson has come up with a plan that has made the Democrats and the Republicans happy. So we'll see what comes of that on Friday. But it seems that in 49 out of the 50 American states, there's one thing, and one thing only, that all Americans agree on, is that they do not believe that there is no conspiracy behind the assassination of JFK. Now, I'm not going to get into conspiracy theories, but to me, it's quite fascinating that in a world where everything else divides the American population, there is one thing that keeps them standing together, is the assassination of JFK. Obviously, very prominent, very enigmatic figure for American politics and American history. Very close links with the Cuban crisis, with the Cold War in general, very mysterious circumstances around the death and the appointment and the aftermath of the assassination as well. So yeah, fun fact of today, everybody believes that he didn't die in normal circumstances. It was all a mystery shrouding the assassination.
What would be interesting to ask them is, do they agree on the theory of which conspiracy? That could create another,
that could create a discussion. Yeah, but at least if you had a club.
Cuban elements, the mafia, the deep state, the defense industry, or whatever. There you would probably have go back to the old American tradition of being divided at home on which theory.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Nicolas, for joining me on this chat. I had an incredible time going through how to challenge the US. So anyone interested in taking up any ideas, you have the manual right here. And for more details, you can read the book Unrestricted Warfare. And thank you also to the listeners for tuning into this episode. You can always give us a follow on whichever platform you have been listening to us on. So we are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and literally everywhere else that you can get your podcast. So give us a follow and you'll be notified of our next episode. And also give us a follow on LinkedIn, Confluence Consultants. We produce weekly updates on everything that matters. So give us a follow there and we will provide you with our insights and hopefully they will be helpful to you. Thanks again for tuning in and hope to connect with you again next month. Take care, everyone.